In this installment of our analysis of Super Mario RPG, we'll take a look at level design. Level design is usually most important in side-scroller or 3D platformers, and less so in traditional JRPGs, but Mario RPG's unique gameplay leaves a lot of room for some really interesting ideas. In a broad sense, the game's success comes from its skillful blending of RPG and platformer elements in a cohesive package, and we can better understand the game's triumphs by examining how its levels are crafted. Let's start with a thought experiment. Pretend you're the director of Super Mario RPG, and you're brainstorming about what kind of game you could make. You want it to feel like a Mario game, so you know you'll need lots of Goombas, question blocks, power-ups, and of course jumping. If you go with the isometric perspective, you'll have to integrate all of these assets into 3 dimensions. What if we try to make a simple level using these concepts? Well, you'd probably end up with something like Mushroom Way, the first real dangerous area of the game. Look how simple the layout is. Visually, it meanders back and forth, but in reality, it's completely linear. There are question blocks in plain sight, and most enemies are visible on screen, although the perspective means that enemies can wait in ambush out of the player's view. Jumping is fun and responsive, and you'll probably experiment with all the controls in the first area. The next screen requires you to jump, but it eases you in by only requiring you to time the jump, not direct it. There's no penalty yet for imprecise jumps, but there is a very obvious goal as well as the means to achieve the goal. Compare this to a similar jump in the second area, Bandit's Way, where a mistimed jump will land you into a group of enemies who always walk towards Mario. At this point, we have a lot of the concepts from traditional Mario games, and we've also added some of our own ideas. If you were to flatten out this area onto a piece of paper, it would more or less resemble a familiar Mario stage. You might ask, why is this so important? In general, good level design gives a short-term goal to the player and makes it fun to achieve that goal. Jump on the Goomba, hit this block, collect those coins. All the important short-term goals remain intact and recognizable. Get to the end, hit this block, beat those Goombas up. This is crucial in giving the game a Mario feel, rather than some unrelated RPG with Mario characters pasted on top. The level design makes it feel familiar, but the perspective makes it unique. Good level design will subtly teach the player all they need to know through oral and visual hints, such as colors, contrast, architecture, audio cues, item and enemy placements, and more. Here's another way classic Mario concepts are translated into an RPG space. This area looks almost identical to the last area in Bandit Way, except there's a question block up here that requires platforming. If you go for it, you'll discover an invincibility star. In a freak accident that doesn't occur anywhere else in the game, the enemies here are suddenly attracted to you now that you can one-shot them. More will continue to flood the screen as long as you're invincible, and you'll always gain a level here as a result, which shows you that invincibility stars are essentially free passes to winning battles. I really love how the use of stars here is explained to the player purely through the developer anticipating what the player will do as they experience this scenario for the first time. Since stars are so rare in the game, you'll always be cautious when you hit a question block. You never know when you'll suddenly stumble onto one and have to make a mad dash around the area killing enemies. It's an important part of the reward system of the game, and it helps draw the player into being more excited to hit treasure blocks and see what's inside. Even though there's a lot to do in them, most of the game's dungeons are only a few screens long. The developers avoid frequently reusing assets or designing needlessly repetitive dungeons, which I think is a way of keeping the gameplay interesting and fluid. Kero Sewers, despite being only a handful of screens, still contains a lot of pipes that can easily disorient you. To give you some help here, the designers fill you in on how to use pipes with a short written tutorial when you first enter the area. Here you're required to jump up and down to different heights, but a mistimed jump will often get you into battle or set you back a few seconds. You'll also be using warp pipes here and throughout the rest of the game, which functionally are exactly the same as in 2D Mario games, but the transition to 3D spaces forces the developers to figure out a way to have Mario enter pipes of 3 dimensions using a D-pad meant for controlling in 2 dimensions. As a result, sometimes you'll have to jump again on top of the pipe to reset your position in order to enter it. It seems a little unintuitive at first that pressing down in a 3D space should make you enter a pipe instead of move south, but this makes the instructions at the beginning of the dungeon all the more useful. We're going to skip around a bit here and look at the Pipe Vault, an optional area. Just like Mushroom Way and Bandit Way, it's reminiscent of the levels in the original Super Mario Bros. Games, namely the underground sections, but it also includes a unique control mechanic that's never used again. When you approach this block, you'll notice a coin underneath, but Mario is physically unable to reach it. It turns out that, quite unintuitively, the solution is to run towards the block. Note that you're running northeast here, so you're holding up and right on the D-pad. And when you're close, pressing down on the D-pad will make Mario duck and slide under the block. This element is so out of place that it harkens back to our discussions in previous longforms on artificial difficulty. Not only is there no way to otherwise duck or slide in the game, but the player is expected to move the D-pad in the exact opposite direction he's running. It's an excellent Easter egg though, and I'm always happy to see these one-off mechanics being used in creative ways. but I very much doubt that most people would come to the logical conclusion that you should be able to duck here and nowhere else in the game. This is one of those examples of a strict adherence to the 2D Mario formula that doesn't really translate perfectly to a 3D space. And it may have been better to leave the sliding mechanic out altogether here. But looking at the pipe vault as a whole, it's basically a linear path, narrow enough that you have to deal strategically with avoiding enemies or else fight them. Again, try laying this level flat on a piece of paper to see how well it matches up with what you know to be a classic Mario type of level design. You'll see it retains much of the familiarity of traditional Mario titles, and the remix of the Mario Bros. Underground theme is another way to instill that familiarity here. The above examples were rather simple in their execution, creating 3D spaces without straying too far from what fans expect of a Mario title. I want to put them somewhere in the middle of a spectrum of how well 2D Mario is implemented in 3D. To give you an idea of what I'm considering to be at the extreme ends of this spectrum, let's look at Booster Tower and Star Hill. Booster Tower is my favorite area of the game in terms of level design, art style, and even music. So far in the game, we've stuck pretty close to RPG cliches. The forest maze that spits you back out at the entrance, the castle town, the sewers. Booster Tower is unlike any RPG cliche in the book in just how weird it is. Its level design is at once disorienting and memorable, and everything about it reminds you of how insane Booster is. The checkerboard pattern on the ground, the enemies who engage you in conversation before jumping into battle with you, the train that Booster rides around to greet you, the Booster lineage portraits, and so on. And of course, we have to mention the transformation room. It almost feels like some crazy dream all the way through, and it certainly doesn't help that Booster himself looks so unusual. If you could summarize Mario RPG's gameplay and tone with a single area, this would be my pick. Booster Tower's layout is so dense that you can't lay it on a piece of paper. It really takes advantage of all three dimensions as you progress through it, but it still feels familiar. Booster's Tower is aptly named because you're mostly ascending vertically, which in any other RPG would be nearly impossible to portray visually as well as Super Mario RPG does. It also means plenty of really fun platforming and traps. There are a few cases where, once again, the isometric perspective can sabotage your jumps. In particular, jumping for this weapon requires that you land on the seesaw below, but with very little visual aid in doing so, you might need to do it a few times. This room has hidden spots on the floor that summon enemies, but you can use these coins to try and guide yourself through. On the way back though, you probably won't have saved enough coins to avoid a fight, but if you paid attention, you can still remember where to jump. So that's Booster Tower. On the other end of our spectrum, we have Star Hill. Star Hill is underwhelming. Let me explain. Star Hill is an excellent example of average or even poor level design. There's nothing terribly wrong with it exactly, but it's unremarkable in every way. It's 3 screens. All of them are roughly flat and shapeless. There are no blocks, there is no platforming, there is only blue. Tag all the flowers, walk in the door. Tag all the flowers, walk in the door. What about short-term goals? What about hitting blocks, jumping up to platforms? The enemies here patrol at high speeds and with unpredictable paths, so you're likely to be ambushed even if you're trying to avoid a fight. Have you ever gotten stuck in another RPG, perhaps in a large dungeon, and while you're trying to figure out where to go, you're constantly being interrupted by random encounters that disrupt your focus? This sort of feels like a miniature version of that, running around looking for all the flowers on each screen. At the end, you'll stumble upon one of the 7 stars, but this one's given to you without a fight, and indeed, without any stakes at all. Considering how all the other stars in the game are preempted by a significant battle challenge, I never quite understood why this star is just casually given to you. The cynic in me thinks of rushed development, but this isn't a feeling I get anywhere else in the game, so I don't think that's the case. You could argue that this is more of a story area because of all the wishes you can stop and read along the way, including Luigi's and Mallow's. Star Hill isn't a bad area at all. It's perfectly passable, but when the rest of the game emphasizes exploration, battles, and platforming so heavily, it feels really out of place. One way to make this area more interesting would be to cut battles out entirely and make the area strictly a platforming or puzzle challenge, either to give you a break from combat or to emphasize the importance of where you are. An improved Star Hill would include some singular mechanical focus that reinforces the core gameplay. What about an even simpler way to fix Star Hill? 1. Have Frog Fuchsius just give you the star when you talk to him. Oh, look what washed up in the pond this morning. Take this star and go to Seaside Town. This achieves the same goal as Star Hill by taking Star Hill out of the game entirely. Second, Star Hill could also have hills, that would be nice. When you hear the name, you'd probably expect to see, a hill or two? Am I being too picky here? We've already seen some great examples of quality level design in the first half of the game, and we'll see that the rest of the game holds lots of great levels for us to explore. Stay tuned for the second half of this analysis, when we'll finish out the game and tie it all together. If you'd like to support the channel, you can find donation links in the descriptions of our videos. We accept PayPal and Bitcoin, but a thumbs up or a subscribe will also do. We're just as grateful either way.